Hey Painting One students, I just wanted to kind of introduce you to our next project. We are going to be creating an illustration of a playing card on large scale on watercolor paper, and the topic or theme of this playing card is going to be of your choosing. Okay, but before we worry about watercolor painting techniques and how to apply those, because that's a whole nother lesson, we got to jump into how to create a design, what to use for inspiration. So what I'm giving you is a template to begin with. So this should help you along a little bit. And this is my example for how I filled out that template. Okay, and kind of came to that, the size of things. Now, if you want to vary the size of yours and go outside this template and not use it at all, I'm fine with that. I just know that sometimes it's a little overwhelming to figure out, like, how do I even go about setting this up? So if I were you, I would use this as a guideline, and if you feel like breaking outside of some of these boundaries, that's certainly permissible. Okay, so the first thing I would do is to try to be a good observer of what we're using for inspiration. So that's a playing card. Now, I'm open to a discussion to you if you want to do something different than a face card, but I think a face card is probably a good place to start just because there's a lot more design and ornamentation in it. It is, you'll notice, a simplified color palette. That doesn't mean that you have to stick to the primary colors and black and white, although that's what most playing cards have as their color palette. You can see, like in mine, I use that as a starting point. For like the parts of the Jack's hat look very similar. Mine is themed Pokemon. It's Pikachu that's kind of taking the place of the Jack, so instead of the J, I have the P for the Pokemon logo instead of the spade or the heart or whatever suit the card was to begin with. I used the Pokeball for that instead. So really this lesson is about substitution, and it's about manipulating an original idea and changing that and making it your own. Okay, so you're going to be doing some looking online, I'm sure, for ideas, and so that's really the first step, would be doing a Google or Bing search and just trying to save as many images to your camera roll that you think you might need as possible, and then start to edit them and subtract, try to just come down to the few that you think you're going to need. But also choosing a suit to model yours after, or choosing a Jack, King, or Queen is probably also going to be a good start. So for my example that I did on my finished playing card here, I used some images that I found online. And so what I did was I used the Jack playing card and other images of Jack playing cards that I found online, and I also found an image of Pikachu, which I used as a subject. And you can see how I made some substitutions and also left some things. So like if there was a heart or a row of hearts with the Jack, then I decided to leave some of those things. And what we'll be doing with this later is transferring it onto the watercolor paper twice. So once you've drawn it out, you really can just duplicate it 2 times. You don't have to freehand that, so that's kind of reassuring. So whatever design you do on this template is going to be duplicated. For this next example that I'm going to do, instead of doing an illustration that's based off something I found online, I'm just going to do one from imagination here, which is also an option too. So I know some of you prefer to work that way. I'm just going to use these playing cards along with some ideas that I come up with as I go. So I'm just going to do a quick time-lapse video just to kind of show you that process, and then we can move on to how to transfer this onto the watercolor paper. Okay, so I did this kind of quickly, but you get the idea. I probably should have planned it more, but this was an example of doing this from your imagination, whereas this was an example of doing this from source material that I found online. You can tell I still looked at the card itself for ideas, okay? Especially I used some of these patterns in what I'm doing here in the background. Now, just because I had drawn it on this rough draft paper does not mean I can't still make last-minute changes. Of course you can. So the next stage of this is going to be covering the background with graphite, and then that way being able to transfer that onto the blank watercolor paper. And we're going to transfer it once, and then we're also going to transfer it twice again. And you are going to have a small gap of space in between where these two parts of the card meet, and at that point you might have to make some choices as to how to finish that off. Okay, so I had to figure that out with my own here in the middle, kind of where those two versions would connect. So to transfer this to the watercolor paper, we have to cover the background with graphite. So the easiest way to do that is just use the side of your pencil. If you're in class with me, I might let you use a graphite stick, which takes a little bit less time. Okay, so the rest of this, I'm going to do a time lapse just so I don't waste your time and you can see the whole process. So I transferred, you can see all the graphite from this drawing. I used a pen, but you could use a pencil when you're doing the transferring. Of course, the back part has to be pencil graphite. And so you can see it's very, very lightly transferred, and that's fine because I'm going to be creating a watercolor painting out of this anyway, so I don't want a whole lot of graphite on there. Now you can see I have to do the same thing to the other side, so now I'm going to flip it over. And I'm going to do the same process to the other side. I'm probably going to apply a little more graphite again before I do this just to make sure. And one thing I didn't mention last time is you could tape this down if you don't trust yourself. I just tried to hold it down as I went, and every once in a while I flip up to see how it's looking so far. But if you are halfway through and then you move it completely, this is not going to look good. So if you don't trust yourself to keep it lined up with the edges, I'd say every time you flip it up just to kind of take a look to make sure everything is transferring properly, just kind of make sure you're realigned with that top edge so that you don't have that problem at the very end where you look at it and it's not lined up. So this is the point you want to get to before we start talking about watercolor techniques and how to apply that, okay? So I have my drawing that I did straight on my template. I applied graphite to the back. I transferred one side over by just lining it up, putting a pressure on it, checking every once in a while to make sure it was transferring, lining it up the other way, doing the same exact thing. And then if there were any areas in the middle, which I still probably have to resolve a couple things here that would make it look like a complete card, I might even add some decorations on the sides and stuff to make this look more like shoulders or something like that. And that's it. Now you'll notice that after I transferred it, I did go back over and re-outline it in pencil just so I could clearly see it and ready to do my watercolor. But I didn't press so hard that I'd be competing with that graphite pigment with my watercolor paints, just because if I start to add water to this, that gray of the graphite is going to start to blend in with my colors. So I might even need to hit this with a little bit of an eraser. I just wanted to make sure it was visible on the video, kind of the goal of this whole thing, okay? So again, this was something that was done from imagination, just looking at the playing card, coming up with an idea, but I think most of you probably feel more comfortable looking at a resource, okay? So this is a long process, I'm not gonna lie, especially even setting up the drawing for the painting. So there's not a whole lot of time to be milling over your idea. Like, you just kind of want to pick one and run with it, and just make sure that you're simplifying it. It's an illustration, it's not a detailed drawing. You'll notice there's not a whole lot of shading. If I did any shading at all, it was in the form of just lines. Okay, so there's no shading with the side of your pencil, and again, that's because it's going to be a painting, not a drawing. Okay, if this was just a drawn illustration, then we could smudge it and create some pencil shading, but we're going to do that all in color later, and you can kind of see on my Pikachu example how, you know, I faded the orange into the yellow to create some shading. We'll be doing that with the paint, not with the pencil. Okay, so I hope that helps at least to get the first stage of this down, and then I'll get you another instructional video for the painting process.